Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched A Bronx Tale from 1993. Now, my impression going into this film was that it is a mob film, and one that is slightly lesser known and lesser respected, let's say, than sort of the big names. About a little, a tier a little below the things like Casino and Goodfellas and those sorts of things. And I certainly understand after watching it why that may be the case. However, I also wasn't truly ready for what this movie actually is because it's a little bit more complicated than your typical mob story. A lot of mob and mob adjacent stories tend to have a pretty clear sort of sense of morality and specific storytelling arc that is really about the rise and fall of mobsters. It's usually about, hubris and greed and how people will backstab you, or how, crime doesn't pay in one way or another, or something like that. But at the same time, often those films sort of glorify, to some level, that life and that experience. Those characters are portrayed as having a really cushy, luxurious life right up until the point that it goes wrong, or at least often some of the characters are. This takes a rather different approach, although it's not immediately apparent that's the case, and it certainly isn't apparent from any of the most famous clips or from the the advertising that's done for this film. I'm actually not sure which version of the poster I'll put up here, but it's there's multiple weird posters for this movie, and kind of undercut expectations for what is in a lot of ways a better film than I think it's maybe even given credit for. Usually, I don't usually hear this movie talked about a whole lot, despite not being that much lesser in the hierarchy, but it is a big gap between, tier one mob and crime films and sort of everything else. And since it doesn't quite make that cut, it doesn't usually get discussed except for by people who have probably seen it a long time ago. And in a way, I think that's a shame because it does take some unique takes. I'll get to the narrative and talk about the plot line a little bit, and I may, spoiler mark that when I do, but we'll get to that in a minute. What is actually kind of interesting about the production of this is that it's directed by Robert De Niro, who is also one of the co-stars. And I believe it is his directorial debut. I'm trying to recall if we've watched another of De Niro's directed films in this series. I feel like we maybe have, but I can't put my finger on it. He also co-wrote the film with one of the other co-stars, Chaz Palminteri, who is this was his breakout role. He also, the reason this movie exists is it was an original theatrical or an original theater performance, one-man show by him that was semi-autobiographical, which adds a whole interesting twist to sort of your understanding of the dynamic here. He has said over the years that this is not that autobiographical, that it is fairly fictional, but it sounds like a lot of the elements of at least the framework are based on reality. And he's even mentioned that some scenes are basically reality to a T with a little bit of punch up. So how much is real? It's sort of not entirely clear, but it seems to be pretty real. And for him to go from he's written it from his childhood perspective, but in the movie he's playing as the mobster leader, the local guy, the local head in this neighborhood. And so that's a really interesting dynamic to have him playing sort of this the mob side of it, and then De Niro as the director playing as his father, and then you have the him as a kid being played by younger kids. It's an interesting dynamic, and it lends to additional interpretation for like how if you were an actor, a new actor especially, play a certain character who you had seen from a different perspective. Anyway, maybe I'm getting too philosophical about that, but I think it's interesting. I think both De Niro and Palminteri do a very good job in this film. I don't think either of them in the other things I've seen them are like really have a huge amount of range. They do have a little bit more than, well, at least De Niro has a bit more variation than just variance on himself. He's got a bit of range. He can emote in a variety of ways, but they are typically fairly typecasted. Palminteri as well. He has had a much less explosive career after this film than Nero, but that's kind of not a fair comparison. But he did play a lot of other sort of similar roles to this, similar mobster, Italian mafia type roles in a variety of things. But it's neither here nor there. They both perform quite well in this film. They have good dynamics. They have good range to be able to show, nuance within a singular character, and that nuance is important to the plot, as we'll get to in a little bit. I also am really impressed by the actor, the young actor. He can't be more than maybe 10 or 12, I'm guessing. I think he's supposed to be 9 in the film. Who plays the young Calogero is the name, I think. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation there, but he goes by C, or so he wants to. And both there are 2 actors who play him, who play the character. One is very young and one's a bit older. Though the youngest one stands out to me especially as being very, very good. Obviously there's a level of nuance to how much acting chops do you expect out of a kid, but you know me, I talk about how there's a lot of bad kid actors out there, and this one does a really good job. I'm very very impressed with him, as like he's emotive. He can, both a lot of like facial emotion and like physical acting, and in his voice as well. And it works really well. I was very impressed. The slightly older version of C, who is, I want to say, he's in high school. I think he's 16, is also pretty good. He's a little less good. There are definitely some lines that I think are missing some emotion to them, or delivered a little bit stilted, but they're serviceable. None of it is too bothersome. It's not great, but it's okay. The one thing that I'm not sure of actually, though, is the narrator. There is a narrator throughout chunks of this film, and I can't find any record of who actually performed the narration. My assumption is that it was the older actor for C, which would line up with my expectations, because man, the narration is really bad. If you've watched this show, you already know my feeling on narration in general. It is very rarely welcome. It is very rarely well performed. Even in something like Goodfellas, it is, just barely good enough to be more of a help than a hindrance. And here it is a real it's really bothersome. Both, it is written very inconsistently and largely not that well. It is somewhat disruptive to the flow of things. It does a little bit too much tell instead of showing. And the delivery is very awkward, often kind of stilted and absent emotion, which really does not add like any. It really detracts from things. It doesn't add anything. And when it's trying to intro a scene and doesn't do that well, or doesn't set you up, or it's talking about an emotional thing but is not articulating that in the voice, that's pretty bad. This does get into kind of a whole different skill set, which is a lot of people are really bad at just reading off of something in front of them. In fact, there are plenty of quite good actors who, when acting, are fine, but if you give them something to just read directly out loud, they're pretty bad at it. A lot of people are really bad at it and don't realize that they are. So, I mean, that's not an excuse. It's just, it's something. So I don't know who did that narration, but it's pretty bad. The rest of the supporting cast is really solid. Some of them are notable faces you've certainly seen before. Some bigger names, some like bit actors who are just, sort of typecast into a certain role, but fill the role really well. Everybody else in the film serves solidly, really no complaints. As far as the production overall, it's a little bit rough. Some of the cinematography can be pretty rough. Certainly the quality even of the film itself. I understand fairly recently, I was looking this up after, fairly recently it was remastered. I did not watch the remastered version, and this one looks pretty rough. There's lots of like weird color grading. There's, bad film grain in places, or film defects. There's some weird stuff all around in the production in general. Really, part of that is probably just a lack of budget. Apparently this was made for about $10 million, so that's not a lot of money even in 1993. And so, budget constraints, I'll give it that. There are certain other things like what's the word I'm looking for? The cinematography. That's the word I'm looking for. I just said it. That are mostly serviceable, but have some bad moments. They also have some good moments. I think there's some shots that are very well done and sort of give a sense of perspective, but on the large part, it is not super well executed. It's okay. It's fine. And that is actually one of the biggest dings I would have on a film that I think is otherwise quite good, is that I think the production value in general could have used a little polish here and there. They do make really good use of their limited budget, I think, in terms of their sets, their locations, and their costuming and stuff like that. I have to imagine, I didn't look this up in detail, but I have to imagine a lot of it was shot in a location. Well, obviously, but not shot on sets is what I mean. So, authenticity, normal sort of neighborhood wear and tear and grime, and the polish of a location, or the lack of polish therein, really does stand out. It feels authentic in that way. The changing costumes are kind of interesting as well. This is set in the 60s, so it's a variety of different a variety of different types of outfits. There are certain things that look a little bit out of place, certain costumes that look a little bit too right out of the box or right out of the packaging. They're a little too shiny, they look a little too nice. But those are fairly minor complaints overall. The costuming feels appropriate for the time, and they have a bunch of what appear to be authentic cars from the period that serve significant roles in the film, and so that goes a long way towards sort of setting the time and the place as well. And so generally the production is pretty all right. Some of the cinematography and stuff could use some work. The writing itself for most of the film is also pretty good. Minus the narration that I was talking about before, which is some of the roughest stuff in the film. A lot of the actual character lines and things like that, a lot of the dialogue is very, very solid. Some of it's really smart. Some of it's a little bit cheesy. But it, gives a feeling of reality to things. It's a bit of a contrast against a lot of the big name crime films, where everybody's a little bit too cool, too suave. They're a little bit too keeping it together a little bit too much. That cool guy vibe that comes off a lot of mob and crime films. And this has more of a feeling of reality. It's more grounded in a sense of place and time and authenticity that, I can't speak to necessarily the specific authenticity, but it feels very, very much more natural, much less cinematic, and I mean that in a positive way. And the overall arc of the plot is a lot more grounded in reality as well. It is structured basically around, it's less of a singular plot and more of a series of vignettes. It's not immediately apparent how this is going to play out, especially in the first few scenes. It feels a little bit more like a traditional mob film where you feel like there's going to be this inciting incident and everything sort of follows, because of that incident. But really that's just the incident that introduces some characters and kind of like sets up an expectation of more normalcy, which is kind of an interesting twist. So the overall arc of the film is more of a series of events, a series of vignettes about specific things that happened to our main, central character C, and what he, in a way, took away from those things. While obviously De Niro and Palminteri are taking up a large amount of the dialogue time, the screen time, this is very clearly cinematically focused on C as the main character, who is sort of absorbing two different sides of events that are happening around him in his neighborhood and two different perspectives on the world. Now, again, this is depending on what posters up here. The movie in its marketing really seems to frame it more like this is going to be an extremely adversarial relationship, and in some ways it is. But contrary to, at least what were my expectations of there being like, a final scene where the conflict comes to a head, the push and pull between the father and local mobster, it's really not that at all. And one of the things I really appreciated about this film was, with these two relatively grounded characters, they also do a good job of not making either of them, or really anybody present, seem truly like a good guy or a bad guy. Like I mentioned, usually in mobster films, there is this sort of framework of these are bad guys, but they're really cool. And this is kind of not the opposite, but it's much more moderated. It's deeply acknowledging of the fact that this is the mobster side of things is problematic, and the whole reason why the dad's upset and the family, sees family is concerned is because, somebody like that in your neighborhood, even if they are doing right by everybody around, is ultimately, a threat to everybody. Ultimately, like, even if they provide for everybody, there's a tension there. There's a governance by the gun kind of thing going on, and you can't really get around that. And when it's organized crime, there's always a paranoia and all these other things that go along with it. And the movie acknowledges that pretty explicitly in dialogue with Sonny, the character, the mobster character, saying, like, acknowledging, like, here's the problems with my life in certain ways. He's not, bemoaning his state or anything. It's not trying to say anything incredibly complicated, either in the text or subtext, but it is acknowledging, this is a life I got into. It's not a great one, but it works for me, kind of thing. And it also, the movie is really careful not to paint sort of either of these two father-like figures, one being the father, but not to paint either of them as being totally right. They're both trying to teach different things. They both have their reasonable concerns, and especially, I think it's notable that that De Niro's character as the father is not painted as incompetent. So often in crime films, the characters who are trying to pull a main character who's like drifting into the crime world, the characters who are are worried about that character or trying to pull him back to the rest of reality, they are often painted as like kind of, even if they're right, they're like incompetent, they're stupid, they've got their own problems they're not dealing with. I'm thinking especially of Goodfellas. There's a lot of, all the people in his life who are trying to help him out of things are not great on their own either. And so this paints a very different kind of thing where, obviously De Niro's character has some very reasonable concerns, but he's also not perfect, and he's short-sighted, and he has, these problems with his viewpoints that he can't acknowledge. And so it's interesting to see these various scenes where there are these indirect counterpoints between the two characters of saying, well, this character says this and he's right about that, and this character says that and he's not right about that, and then vice versa. The next scene, maybe the other one's right about something, maybe the other one has better, more nuanced advice or more forward-thinking advice, and it's a really nice play between those things. There's also a significant subplot about racial tensions, and that's a whole complicated thing to get into, especially talking about the 60s in New York, and really the whole history of immigration and segregation and all these other things, and how Italians were treated and how black people have been treated and all these other things. But it takes a fairly careful, focused, and reasonably nuanced take on that, acknowledging that, there were significant racial tensions and racial strife, and a lot of people, held an inherent bigotry against each other, and that it was, certainly in the 60s, it would have been extremely unpopular, if not straight up extremely dangerous, to be engaging really in any way with a neighborhood with people of a different race. And that's something I've never really seen in another mob film. It's a breath of fresh air, and it adds it's another catalyst for adding nuance to a narrative that might otherwise feel a little bit clunky. So having that's a major subplot, and it works. It's got its ups and downs, and I mean that in a positive way. It's not like one character always has the right opinion. It's, we're working through this. We're, sorting out how to deal with this tension that is existent all around it, and all of the people who, have a concern about themselves, the people, their neighbors, and then the people in the next neighborhood over, type of thing. And that was a really interesting way, both as a plot of its own and as a sort of a catalyst for other related events that happen in the film. It's usually and again in a lot of mob films, a lot of crime films, if race is brought up at all, it's brought up in a pretty ham-fisted way, and usually racism is sort of hand-waved as, oh, it was just the time, or just the just the people who are in this situation who are behaving badly. But I think this takes a solid approach and a solid beat to like be considerate both of, here's how it really was, here's the unpleasant realities of that, and then here's the people who had a different viewpoint or wanted to improve things type of stuff. It's really, yeah, I was kind of surprised that subplot was in there, and it was one of the nice surprises because it works really well. I think that covers most of, I didn't really need, I was able to talk about it without really having spoiled anything there. So, yeah, like plot wise, I think this is really solid. It has a decent arc despite being somewhat disconnected in its vignettes. And I think it comes to a close in a way that feels satisfying for the narrative it's trying to tell. It's also the kind of thing I could see being dramatically misunderstood or misinterpreted. In fact, I've seen some takes on this film before that were, well, as with many crime films, that really sort of have a brain dead kind of viewpoint of like, oh yeah, mobster cool, says cool thing, makes cool reference. Boy, talking about Machiavelli, that's like the coolest shit ever. Very, high school history class type of mentality. So anyway, that's a digression unto itself. I think this is a really solid film. I think it's got a lot going for it. I think most of its problems are fairly minor, mostly in the production aspect of things. And I think it has a lot more nuance and finesse than I certainly would have expected. I was really expecting this to be sort of a discount, in a lot of ways, sort of a discount version of those top tier mob films, but it really surprised me in a bunch of ways, and happily so. It also gave me little thoughts about some other films. It reminded me, this is not a fair comparison, it reminded me of Do the Right Thing a little bit, which is a movie I adore. I think it's one of the greatest films ever made. And this is not a fair comparison due to that level of greatness. But there were aspects of that came through, especially with, Do the Right Thing is in a very significant way about racial tension, and this is not taking nearly as detailed or nuanced a look at that, and is not produced or written nearly as well, but it gave me enough of that memory to be like, oh yeah, that's a nice, there's some nice parts of that I see in here too. So anyway, if you don't feel like watching this, you should definitely watch Do the Right Thing, because it's very, very good. But anyway, I digress. Yeah, very solid film that I was happy to have watched, pleasantly surprised by a lot of its content. Definitely check it out if this is your flavor at all. Anyway, thank you for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched, and I'll see you guys next time.